Good evening, friends and neighbors of Northborough. My name is Kathleen Howland. I moved to Northborough about 5 years ago and very pleased to introduce you to one of my favorite people. We were in a book club together many years ago, and I've seen her evolve into becoming a very astute technology safety educator who has brought forth changes in her hometown of Ashland that I think we need to seriously consider here in Northborough. And we would like to have an opportunity tonight to think about these hazards with technology. So let me introduce Doucette to you.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. It's a privilege to be here tonight. 4 years ago, I had no idea that there were things about wireless technology that we need to be careful with. And it was actually at our book group one night when a friend of ours who's an electrical engineer had suggested there could be biological effects from wireless technology. And I had run the Ashland Education Foundation for a number of years and personally helped to run 7 campaigns to get technology into our schools because it was not something we could take care of in our budget item at that time.
Sure.
So, and then not long after book group that night, something crossed my desk in written form that also suggested caution around wireless technology. So I went to our IT director in the schools, and by that point I was actually working for Ashland Public Schools as our grant coordinator. And in that role I also helped to bring in iPads and Chromebooks and Apple TVs and smart boards and what I thought was all this great technology, and I thought we were filling an important gap. But when I asked our IT director what he knew about wireless radiation, and he said, never heard of it.
That's shocking.
Yeah, so he comes back, he went and looked, and he comes back and he says, oh, the FCC says it's fine. And I thought, okay, but the research I had begun doing independently was showing that there was great evidence of harm. And when we talk about wireless technology, what we're talking about is this spectrum of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. So in this microwave spectrum, we have cell towers, we have utility smart meters, we have microwave ovens, the cordless baby monitors, the cordless gaming devices, and everything Wi-Fi. It's actually radar. That's what this technology is. And unfortunately, it was developed by our governments to be a human weapon. Yeah,
that's
so
sobering and frightening all at the same time.
So that wasn't good. So I started my investigation, and I found a report called the Bioinitiative Report that was started back in 2007. And back then, a group of world scientists and public health experts got together and said, we know that this came out of the military. We know it was not developed for civilian use. But what does it mean now that we're using it commercially? So in 2007, they said, we need to do more research to find out what this means. And so from 2007 through 2012, more studies were done all over the world, and not just a couple of studies, but 1,800 more studies were done.
Impressive.
Yes, so they came back and they compiled all the research, and this is just the cover. But if you were to look at the real report, it's like 1,400 or 1,600 pages, and it contains peer-reviewed, published scientific studies. And just to go through a little bit of the table of contents. Now,
yes, please.
These are key scientific evidence. Damage to sperm and reproductive systems, that's the one that got me on my feet. They have taken male human sperm and exposed it to the radiation coming out of a laptop, and it changed the DNA, it slowed the motility of the sperm, and it caused far fewer sperm to become viable in just 4 hours of exposure.
Right.
And I know, Kathleen, you have a daughter, I have 2 daughters, and all we have over our reproductive organs is soft tissue.
Yes.
So there's nothing protecting those reproductive organs there. So there are, in addition to the sperm studies, there are other reproductive studies on women and girls as well. Evidence that children are more vulnerable. So children are not just little people.
That's right.
And you know, because you're a neuroscientist, right? Their central nervous system is still under development. Their DNA is still under development. Their immune system is still under development. So all of that can be impacted by the radiation that's being emitted by all of our wireless devices today. And in fact, there's a really good visual in this brochure by the Environmental Health Trust. And there is a scientist named Dr. Om Gandhi who has done the modeling to show that an adult brain, so this is like if the model were here and you've got the phone up to your ear.
Sure.
This is how deeply it penetrates in an adult brain. This is how far it goes into a 10-year-old's and almost all the way through the skull of a 5-year-old child.
Because of the density, yes.
Yep, so a child's skull is thinner. Their brain at these stages is more aqueous, so it's absorbing actually more radiation. So we continue to look at this. There are very significant correlations between what we're now seeing in children presenting on the autism spectrum and the symptoms that we get with electromagnetic radiation exposure. Dr. Martha Herbert over at the Autism Lab at Mass General has been doing analysis of this, and she's seeing great correlations. So that's something definitely to pay attention to. We have a new term called electrosensitivity or electrohypersensitivity, and that occurs with people who are exposed to wireless radiation and may begin feeling symptoms like a stabbing headache, dizziness, nausea, tinnitus, or the ringing in the ears. It could be the stomach gets upset because it affects the mast cells in our gut lining. And so there are a lot of symptoms that people are experiencing today that they don't even know to connect to wireless. And insomnia is really a big one too. My niece, who's in her 40s and has a couple of young children, had said to me, you know, my girlfriends and I were all talking. We didn't know if it's because it's just perimenopause, but none of us are sleeping anymore. We just don't sleep. So I taught her about this, and I saw her a week later, and she said, after you showed me how to turn everything off in my home, especially in my bedroom, she said, my head hits that pillow, and I wake up the next morning refreshed. And I thought, you know, everybody should have a right to know that this issue exists. So
I'm so glad we're doing this tonight for that reason.
Yeah. So it goes on from the electrosensitivity to the blood-brain barrier. I know, that's a scary one because our body has built-in barriers to keep toxins out of areas where the body wouldn't know what to do with them, right? Now we have toxins from all sorts of environmental agents, with wireless radiation being one of them, that are compromising those barriers. So for the first time in humanity, we have toxins going in places in our bodies that we've never, ever had before. And so it goes on to the brain tumors. I think that brain tumors may be the one thing that perhaps the public has heard a little bit about. And the story that I've since found out behind that is back in the 90s, Larry King did a show with a gentleman whose wife died of brain tumors. And the oncologist has said this patient died of these unusual tumors on the side of her head. Typically, brain tumors would start within the brain. These were on the side of her head, and they lined up with the antennas on her cell phone. So that kind of became a PR nightmare for the telecommunications industry. So they stepped forward and said, well, we have the financial resources. Let us do the research on that. So for years they did, and they hired the head of the CTIA, which was then called the Cellular Telephone Industry Association. They've since rebranded to be CTIA, the wireless industry. The head of the CTIA hired Dr. George Carlo. He put 200 scientists in place, and they went ahead and did the studies for years. And they came back and reported back to the head of the CTIA that that is indeed carcinogenic. And the CTIA did not inform the public back in the 90s.
Right.
So that's the brain tumors, which are still ongoing today. There are effects for genotoxicity, neurotoxicity, because it really hits our central nervous system. This is tying into a lot of the anxiety, depression, the social emotional issues that so many more children are experiencing today. I suspect in Northborough it's similar to Ashland, where we have had more hospitalizations among our student body than we've ever had before. And
Both psych and general medical?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. And it can't be primarily genetic because we haven't even gone cradle to grave in the time that we've seen an escalation in so many diseases. You know, fibromyalgia, autism, Alzheimer's, a lot of these diseases. Youth bipolar is up like 11,000%. And it can't be primarily genetic. We've done this to ourselves, so we've got to figure out our way out of it. And we're just at one point in time, and we'll figure it out. So our school committee in Ashland looked at this, but then they were also seeing other studies that said no evidence of harm. So our school committee was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because this isn't their job. This isn't what they do day in and day out. But to their huge credit, they formed a subcommittee, they looked at it, and when they got to looking at the fine print that comes with every one of our devices, like if you have an iPhone, for example, you would go into settings, you'd scroll down a little bit to general, then you'd look at the top and go into about, and then you would scroll all the way down to legal, and way at the bottom of legal, you will see RF exposure. That's radio frequency radiation exposure. And it will tell you in there to use a hands-free device or to use speakerphone or to keep your device X amount of distance from your body.
Right.
Else you may exceed the FCC's limits for public radiation exposure.
And how strict are the FCC limits?
Yeah,
I figured.
They're very permissive. So the
Yes.
way the FCC set up their limits was 20 years ago, based on a theory from a decade even prior to that. So what the FCC did is they said, okay, we're going to take this simulated adult mannequin, we'll call him Sam. He's an adult male, 220 pounds, 6'2", in the 90th percentile of military fitness. We're going to fill his head with gel, and we're going to see how much exposure from one device does it take in a half an hour to raise the
Just a half an hour.
temperature of that gel. That's it. That's all we've had. There's been no safety testing done, nothing for fetuses, for children, for the elderly, for those with existing health conditions, because if your body's already fighting something else, your biosphere is already compromised, and now having this radiation around you all the time is very risky. So this is what our standards are based on. I'm sorry, they're not even standards, they're guidelines. We do not even have a radio frequency radiation exposure standard in this country.
So this regulatory commission is offering no guidance, and they're not up to date with the science.
They are not up to date with the science.
It's an important point.
It's a very important point.
Yeah.
And in fact, our Government Accountability Office in 2013, right on the heels of this bioinitiative report coming out, they called up the FCC and said, re-examine this and let's see about getting our guidelines up to par with the current science. And that has been an open docket for what, 4 years now? And the FCC has done nothing. So at the time when I raised this with our school committee, I quite honestly thought I would raise my hand and say, I think we have a problem here. They'd say, we've got it, I could be on my merry way. But to the person, not one single member in our school community understood what the current science is telling us. But to their huge credit, when they read the fine print, they said, well, why wouldn't we do at least what the manufacturers are telling us? Because there was nobody up at the Department of Public Health, there was nobody at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education who could advise them. I just stumbled onto this because of our dear friend Wendy. But to Ashland's huge credit, they came up for what they called best practices for mobile devices. Turn off these devices when not in use. Right now, the default is all Wi-Fi all the time. It's always just on.
Absolutely.
We don't need that. Turn on the Wi-Fi access points only when needed. So don't leave those emitting at our children and our staff all day long. And always place a mobile device on a solid surface, preferably something non-metal, because metal amplifies radiation. So, you know, with our metal jewelry, with children who have piercings, metal rim glasses, underwires and bras, that's drawing the radiation even more into your space. So I was very grateful that Ashland Public Schools did this.
Most impressive.
Yeah, so, but when I saw the draft, it said best practices for Wi-Fi safety. But because when our school committee put this on their agenda, there were very well-regarded members of our community who have only been trained in what the FCC guidelines are.
I see.
They haven't been privy to the current science. So they came up and said, well, our children deserve to have the best that our district can provide to them, so we should not really be thinking about going backwards on Wi-Fi. So again, it became very contentious. So to kind of make it a little more peaceful, instead of saying best practices for Wi-Fi safety, it came out as best practices for mobile devices. And I was working for the school district at the time, and I sat through the training, and really this is what they said, which is great. But they never actually told the staff on the first day back to school, when they get all of their anti-bullying, physical restraint, mandated reporter, all that training, we just did this. But they weren't told that it's microwave radiation and that it is biologically hazardous.
It certainly seems more benign.
Yeah,
its writing.
I met with our superintendent the next day, and I have great regard for our superintendent. He had been our high school principal for a number of years, and he had really put in a nice culture of ethics into our school. So I knew he was going to be a wonderful superintendent, but it was his first foray into being a superintendent, and the poor guy had just walked in just as all this was rolling out. And so I said to him, I said, I am so grateful, but I'm also concerned because we didn't tell the teachers, and I know how busy they are. If we have this little sign amongst all the other things hanging in their classroom, how are they actually going to remember to do this? And he said, I can only do today what the school committee tasked me with, and that's to laminate these signs and to train the staff what those are. And I said, okay. And then I said, well, can we tell the parents? And he just went, Wow. And I said, okay. But he said, I did go back to my district, because he lives in a different town, and he checked, and his 2 children go to schools where at that point in time they did not have Wi-Fi on in the classrooms. So that told me at least he understood that this issue is worth looking into.
Good.
So, you know, my brain goes towards solutions. And by this point, I had already talked to our town leaders. The only person who had any clue that there could be biological hazard was our then town manager, and he had been a fighter pilot. And our government still checks in with him to see about radiation fallout from being up in the airplane. So, but I had spoken to our health agent. He didn't understand wireless radiation. He did tell me, though, that when the telecom companies came in with cell towers, they were told at the municipal level that if anybody claims harm, there's nothing to be done. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, at the municipal level, we're obliged to follow the state, and the state is obliged to follow the industry, which put in the federal guidelines in the Telecommunications Act back in 1996, 1997.
Yes.
And those basically say if there's any environmental harm, that you can't come claim any damages. So our health agent assumed that Wi-Fi was going to be the same, but as it turns out, it's not. Back when the whole .com boom happened, a lot of different groups got part of the licensing for the spectrum for 3G and 4G, which is 3rd and 4th generation technology.
Yes.
So when Wi-Fi hit, it went out to a lot of different people. The industry itself got a hold of the telephone technology. So that's how they got such a lock on cellular, whereas right now they don't have quite that lock just yet on Wi-Fi. So yeah, so we were at a certain point in time, so I'm thinking, well, how can we let the parents know? Because even if parents know to shut everything off at night, then the body would be able to do proper cell regeneration and repair and cell growth while we're sleeping.
Sure.
So I, by that point, had invested in a meter that allows us to see how much radiation is emitted by one of these devices. So I went to local office hours with my senator, who's Senator Karen Spilka, and I taught her this, and then I measured her cell phone and her district director's laptop. And with an acoustometer, this is about a $350, $400 scientific device. When I turn it on, if there's any wireless radiation in the area, it will either be green, which is where the science is still being discovered as to whether or not it's harmful at that level. Yellow is where people with electrosensitivity begin to feel symptoms. You know, again, the headaches, the nosebleeds, the ear bleeds, the tingling, skin rashes that aren't explainable, nausea, dizziness, all of that can come on in the yellow. And then wherever it goes into red, we have a ton of scientific study behind it. Now, when our government first started educating around lead, we had about 10,000 studies done. Today, with electromagnetic radiation, we have over 24,000 studies on the books, and a vast majority show biological effects. So this is called an acoustometer, meaning this is an invisible toxin. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't hear it, you can't taste it. You might feel it, but you might not know that those are symptoms because of it. So when I turn this on, if there was nothing in here, we just hear a little bit of a crackle, and that would indicate the meter's working. So I'll turn it on, and that tick, 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 tick.
Yes.
So that is what we're hearing. You see, it's already going into yellow. I keep my cell phone, as a rule, in airplane mode because that shuts off the antennas in here. But to give a demonstration, I will put this back in active mode. And it's now searching for a handshake with the nearest cell tower and the nearest router, because this one single device has up to 5 antennas in it. It's got I'll turn it down a little bit. It's got a cellular antenna, it's got a data antenna, it has a Bluetooth antenna, a wireless antenna, and a locator antenna.
Oh my goodness.
And we don't need that all the time. So again, I'll put it back in airplane mode because I prefer not to be exposed to this. But just by turning it on and off, you see it jumps way to the top of the charts. And this is what we're exposing ourselves to all the time. So now it's back down in the green area, and I'm not exposing you or I. But what that was doing here was, let's say radio and TV, that is a continuous rolling sine wave that our bodies can acclimate to fairly well, unless we happen to be right under the broadcast tower. Just like with high power tension lines, you don't want to be under any kind of a strong electromagnetic field like that.
Sure.
With digital technology, on top of that rolling sine wave, there's a pulsed, spike, erratic data packet on a square wave. So for all that data that we're streaming back and forth, it's doing this to our cells billions of times per second, constantly, constantly, constantly. And that keeps us in a very stimulated state that our body is not meant to be in. That's like the fight or flight mode, and it keeps us constantly jacked up. So that's why it's important to learn to use these devices safely, and especially keep your sleeping areas a sanctuary. As a neuroscientist, you'll appreciate this. So the brain has the pineal gland, and as part of our circadian rhythm in the wee hours of darkness, the pineal gland will release melatonin. Melatonin, in part, its job is to go in and clean up debris in our systems, right? So not only does this constant pulse go at us all the time, which is really tough on us, but now it's disabling our cleanup mechanism in our brain because our pineal gland cannot differentiate between natural light, and it only lets out the melatonin in the wee hours of darkness. It can't differentiate between natural light and this light energy form that's microwave radiation. So as I know is near and dear to many of our loved ones with breast cancer, a lot of women who experience that, and now men, we're seeing men with breast cancer for carrying their devices too near to their bodies. Almost across the board, melatonin is very much depleted. And so this could help to explain. And there is certainly more than one mechanism. There are certainly genetic factors, but this is one that we could very easily reduce or altogether eliminate.
Sure.
So Senator Spilka was gracious enough, you know, when I was showing her what this is and I measured her devices, I said, is there something you can do from your end at the legislative level to just give people the right to know that this technology is not harmless? And so Senator Spilka put me together with a lawyer in her office, and we crafted a bill last session that would really basically just bring the right, bright minds together at the table. Get pediatricians, get environmental doctors, because regular doctors have no idea, they've never been trained on this, but the environmental doctors get the conundrum cases and they know what our environmental toxins are doing to us. So get the telecom to the table, you know, get the school committee to the table, get all the right bright minds, get the Department of Public Health, get the Department of Public Utilities, everybody to the table, and let's examine the actual science that was not funded by industry.
That's right.
All right. And that's what was so complex when our school committee looked at this, because here we have this huge volume of science saying harm, but what are these other studies that are showing no harm? Well, you know, down the road I discovered that many of those are funded by industry under conditions that were meant to show no harm.
Very reminiscent of the tobacco industry.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And with tobacco, we knew for decades that it was a biological hazard before 1964, when the Surgeon General finally held a press conference and said, this is a biological hazard. And that's when we started labeling the packaging, right? So Senator Spilka introduced a bill for me last session. I was kind of told, don't get your hopes up, because a bill, the first time out the gate, almost never goes anywhere. And if it's introduced by a constituent, then that's kind of a red flag to the legislators that perhaps they don't need to spend a lot of time on this bill. So, but at the time that that bill came up for hearing, there was a group of world experts who came to Massachusetts to teach our legislature about wireless radiation and the need to have right-to-know legislation. So it was kind of neat, because Senator Spilka's bill was already out there, and then we had Dr. Deborah Davis, who is one of the leading experts in this field. She's actually earned a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate with the climate change issue. She's written a book on cancer. She has served in top posts in our government, in our presidential appointments. So Dr. Davis brought a panel of experts to the State House in Massachusetts to teach us. So we got to hear from her the science. She brought with her Dr. Sharma from India, and in the Indian government, Dr. Sharma is the scientist responsible for recommending public radiation exposure limits. And in India, they've actually done a lot of the studies through their government. So he has done the sperm studies, for example. So their guidelines were set way up here where our current FCC guidelines are. Dr. Sharma and his team have brought them down 90%. Wow. So it can be done.
Yes.
It's going to be a shakeup, but I think if we choose health over corporate profit, I don't think it'll take too much thought to see what we need to do.
Sure.
So Dr. Davis, Dr. Sharma, and then there was a technologist on the panel. And I was like, wow. You know, it was actually Frank Clegg, who was the former president of Microsoft Canada. Yeah, and I'm like, right. And so I was learning about this for 2 years, but I really had nobody to talk to up until that point. And I'm like, wow, I actually get to hear something from a technologist. So Mr. Clegg, when he retired, Microsoft is on the software end of things, and he knew enough not to have Wi-Fi on at home, and when his teenage daughters were clamoring for the latest technology, he refused. When he retired, he personally sought out a dozen of the top scientists around the world and medical experts and sought their counsel. And he came back and said, our guidelines and standards in North America do not protect us. And I went, wow.
Wow, indeed.
So rather than just enjoying his cushy retirement that he worked so hard to earn, God love Frank Clegg, because he has founded Canadians for Safe Technology, and he's up there in Parliament trying to do what we're trying to do here in Massachusetts. And he resigned from every technology board that he served on, and he turned around to his peers and he said, as soon as you can prove to me that this is safe, give me a call. And he said, my phone has not rung.
It's because it's on airplane mode.
I know, good thing. Very cute.
Thank you.
So, also on that panel, we had Janet Newton of the Electromagnetic Radiation Institute. And Janet Newton, I think, is out of Vermont, but she came down to teach us that for the folks who have to go up and work, say, on a rooftop, from your HVAC guys to your elevator repair persons to the people who are up there working on the telecommunications systems.
In the steeples, yes.
There are guidelines to protect them that, after studies have been done, are showing that they're not even doing that. So there's a certain contingency in that population that is starting to find health effects from being so close to those huge fields of electromagnetic radiation. And then the fifth presenter at that forum was Dr. Catherine Steiner-Adair, who is a child psychologist. And at that point on my journey, I was thinking, I thought we were here to learn about biological effects. You know, what's a child psychologist doing here? And I was so grateful for Dr. Steiner-Adair's talk, because in addition to all of the electromagnetic radiation, what we're seeing in our digital society today is that she said she consults all across the US, Asia, Europe, everywhere she goes. Kindergarten teachers, first, second grade teachers, more and more are reporting that children are showing up for school without the ability to make or maintain eye contact. They expect their teachers to be edutainers, and if something goes wrong, they have not properly developed the human capacity to self-soothe. So they're falling apart instead of pulling it together. And perhaps even worse, they have not developed the human capacity for empathy. And so you have children lashing out. You have children who are not able to read social cues. But the good news is, and she wrote a wonderful book called The Big Disconnect, and it takes you through chapter by chapter, age by stage of childhood development. And in The Big Disconnect, she teaches us what it means and how we can work with our families to use technology safely, but to have this be the primary interaction that develops a proper child's brain.
Sure.
I loved her example. She said children should be outside under the rhododendron, going into deeper and deeper and deeper levels of imaginary play, because that is biologically what's building those synapses in the brain. And working with adults, working with other children, they're developing everything, all the nonverbal cues and all of that that you don't get from a one-dimensional screen that's maybe teaching little Tommy Tomcat how to kick and fight and scratch. And these are not evidence-based programs. And so what you're giving your child has as much impact as the quantity of time that you're allowing them to spend on it. There's another excellent book called Reset Your Child's Brain by Dr. Victoria Dunkley, another child psychologist. And she takes you through what is happening with and meltdowns raise grades and boost social skills by reversing the effects of what she has coined electronic screen syndrome. So she has a 4-week protocol in there where the first week you as parents and caregivers become educated on this issue. And then you identify throughout the child's day, where are the technology access points, right? Are they going up to little Johnny's house up the street and playing video games?
Sure.
Are they taking things into bed with them at night? And really examine where they are getting their technology from. And then the next 3 weeks, you do a withdrawal. And as frightening as that sounds, because some parents already recognize that you try and take your kid away from that device, and they blow a hissy fit, they may go into a rage that's on par with withdrawals from addictions to alcohol, to drugs, to pornography, to tobacco. It's all going into the same receptors in the brain as digital addiction. So thank goodness that we have, for as much scientific study as we have on the biological impact, there's also a huge body of evidence on the psychological impact. And unfortunately, the industry identified that our children were an untapped target market. And they came up with this 21st Century Learner campaign. They worked with our government for the E-rate program to bring Wi-Fi in all over the place. They're making the teachers incorporate technology into all of our school lessons.
Yes.
And as enticing as that sounds, the science does not support that they are learning any better, and in fact it shows we are having far less effective outcomes with technology than schools that have said we are not going to use technology, and if we do, we're going to use it very judiciously.
I think digital addiction is such a powerful word to just pause and really take that in.
I know.
And the use of all of the of advertising masked as pedagogy to bring this forth.
Yeah, and we are starting to see some of this come mainstream. So 2020 has done a couple of segments on this, and they interviewed, I think it was a gentleman who had worked with Google, who was starting to see how these apps were being developed, and they were starting to learn the brain science to figure out how to keep people hooked in front of their screens. So they are mindfully developing addictive behaviors. One example was, if you're out on social media, they will withhold likes, and they'll bundle them together, and then you'll get like 32 of them all at once, and you get this huge dopamine hit, right?
Right.
And they have a ton of different strategies to keep you on that device, even though scientifically we know that is biologically hazardous. So it was impressive that 2020 did a study on that. Out in California, years ago, San Francisco tried to teach their constituents about safety measures that could be taken around wireless technology. The industry came in with their deep pockets and big lawyers, and the CTIA sued, and it did not progress. More recently, the city of Berkeley out in California went back and examined what happened in San Francisco, and they said, okay, we won't get into the science. All we want to do is raise this fine print to the point of sale. So not buried 5 levels down in your iPhone, not buried in the fine print of the little tiny manual that comes with your device that nobody reads.
Nobody ever reads.
Right. They said, we just want to raise the fine print into large print. At the point of sale, there will be a notice that says, if you put this device in your bra or in your pocket or otherwise carry it next to your body, you may exceed the FCC guidelines for public radiation exposure. It was passed unanimously in Berkeley.
Yes.
As expected, the CTIA, the Wireless Industry Association, came after Berkeley.
Sure.
And one of the statements that was in that Berkeley ordinance said, children are more vulnerable, so we need to know especially to protect them. In order to make that statement, you would have to get into the science. And so Berkeley was made to take the children piece out, which is crazy on so many levels because we should be protecting our children above everything else. But they took that out, and then the court ruled that the Berkeley ordinance would stand. The CTIA came back and sued a second time. The ordinance stood. They came back a third time and sued, put an injunction against the ordinance, saying that it is an infringement of their First Amendment rights to be raising that fine print. 2 out of the 3 judges on the 9th Circuit District came back and said the Berkeley ordinance stands. The 3rd judge that was on there, her husband works for the industry. She should likely have recused herself, but she didn't. But thankfully the other 2 upheld it. This may still go to the Supreme Court. And Professor Lawrence Lessig out of Harvard's Law School Center for Ethics said he is the one who's been defending Berkeley from the beginning and helped to write the ordinance. He said he will defend Berkeley pro bono all the way to the Supreme Court. So we're at an exciting point in time because things are starting to pop.
Yes.
And in addition, out at the University of California at Berkeley, there's a Dr. Joel Moskowitz, who's one of the directors in their School of Public Health. And way back when San Francisco was even looking at this, around 2009, 2010, the California Department of Public Health had written a public health fact sheet on how to use cell phones more safely. And it never saw the light of day. It was never released to the public. Under the California equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act, Dr. Moskowitz requested a copy of that fact sheet, and he was denied access to it. So another lawyer at Berkeley pro bonoed, and they sued the state of California Department of Public Health to issue that fact sheet, and they won. So California has a fact sheet that says cell phones and health, and it talks about the radio frequency radiation, it talks about needing to keep distance, it talks about what electromagnetic fields are and how they are the man-made ones are much greater, like 10 to the 18th power greater than our own natural bioelectromagnetic field. And they tell you simple things like increase the distance, use the speakerphone, all the stuff that's in the fine print. Keep it away from your body, limit your phone use when it's in active mode, and keep your phone calls short if you have to make one. Use a landline. That's not harmful.
Yes, we just put one in.
Good.
Yes.
And I have replaced, so those DECT cordless phones that most of us all bought into, right?
Sure.
Little walk around the house.
Yeah.
That's like having your own private cell tower.
Yes.
In your house. It beacons 24/7. In Europe, they have an eco mode where it only beacons when there's a call and play, but our infrastructure does not support that technology at this point in time. So, Senator Spilka's bill came up for public hearing right around the time that this expert panel came to Massachusetts. And unbeknownst to me, there were people all over Massachusetts trying to educate their communities about this. So I got to meet people from Dover, Sherborne, people from Natick, people from Framingham, people from Worcester,
great.
all over the state. It was like, I think I finally found my people, right?
Yes, your tribe.
So I think because those folks sent in testimony for Senator Spilka's bill, and the scientists, and the doctors, and the people who become electrosensitive, we had a great amount of testimony to support the bill, and it was actually reported out of the Joint Committee on Public Health favorably.
Nice.
And I said, okay, so now what happens? And I was told at the next stage in the legislative process, we have thousands of bills that are introduced every session that these committees are responsible for reviewing, and they can't possibly really get into the thick of all of them. So they bundle them at the next stage, and then they're voted on in bundles. And the lot
That's
that
right.
this bill went into did not progress. And I said, okay. And I said, but it's better than we had to start with, right? So I said, so what's next? And they said, come back next fall, because every legislative session goes for 2 years. So come back next fall, and if Senator Spilka is agreeable, we'll talk about perhaps reintroducing the bill. And I thought, okay, that's great. So I did. And Senator Spilka is now the chairwoman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, which means she has responsibility for the Massachusetts budget. It's a very big job, very time consuming. And so she may not have quite as much time in her district as she once did. So her office said, we just talked about the bills from her district. Let me go get my notes. And he comes back and he says, oh yeah, she is going to reintroduce this bill, and she's going to do it under her own name this time. And I went,
Super.
that's fabulous.
Yes.
That's fabulous. So we have Senate Bill 1628 in the legislature. It's a resolve creating a special commission to examine the health effects of electromagnetic fields by Senator Karen Spilka. And that will get the right minds to the table. There was also a bill last session to address the right to decide whether you or I would like to have a wireless radiation emitting device on our house for our utility meters. So do we want to have an electric meter that emits radiation? Do we want to have a water meter? Do we want to have a gas meter? Do we want to have a solar meter? All those are being put right on our house without anybody's informed consent.
Right.
So Senator Michael Moore out in Worcester has introduced a bill, again this session, called Senate Bill 1864, an act relative to utilities, smart meters, and ratepayers' rights. So that is actually going to be heard tomorrow. And I know by the time this airs, that will have come and gone. But because the legislative session is just beginning, folks can send in testimony or a simple letter to our legislators to say, please support these bills. So I knew about those two bills going in, and then once the bills are introduced, there's a little open window where you might ask your legislators to co-sponsor. And the day that the representatives could co-sponsor up to, that afternoon, I saw another bill pop out of the woodwork. Massachusetts House Bill 2030, an act relative to best management practices for wireless in schools and public institutions of higher learning. Representative Carolyn Dykema introduced that, and basically she has become familiar with Ashland's best practices, and she's asking in this bill for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to form a commission.
Wonderful.
So that we don't have to do this district by district, so we can have finally that higher authority that would make my district and your district feel comfortable saying we're going to scale back, turn off the Wi-Fi, and just use hardwired access points. So then I thought that was really awesome.
That is amazing.
And before that afternoon wrapped up, two more bills came up. Now these are both related to that Berkeley ordinance, to give people the right to know, not to keep these on their bodies. So Senate Bill 107 is an act relative to disclosure of radio frequency notification, so raise the fine print. That's expected to come up for hearing in September. And then Mass Senate Bill 108, again with Senator Julian Cyr, he's out of the Cape and the Islands. Let's especially look at children and look at what today's science says about handheld devices and what the recommended best practices are. Other countries already have laws. France outlawed cell phones and wireless radiation emitting devices in nursery schools, preschools, kindergartners. And they're lowering the emissions and saying it can only be turned on when it absolutely has to be used in the upper grades.
Beautiful.
So there are, and Russia tried telling us in 1968 that we should not be employing this in the commercial sector. So if you were to look at how much different countries allow for public radiation exposure levels, Salzburg, Austria allows 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared. So basically on a little piece of your skin, how much radiation is allowed? 0.1 microwatts. Switzerland's at 4, China 6, Russia, Italy 10. We are up at 580. So we are literally thousands of times higher than where we know biological effects are taking place. So we've got our work cut out for us.
You sure do, but you've got a lot of momentum.
We do have a lot of momentum.
That's beautiful.
And actually, down in Maryland, there have been parents and social workers and scientists who have been working with their Department of Public Health, and they have become the first in the nation to advise the schools to use hardwiring with the antennas turned off, with the access points turned off. And the beauty of it is once you hardwire, not only is it biologically safer, but you get a really fast connection.
Yes, you do.
Your data is far more secure in a hardwire setting than it is going through the air, because you know, you hate to think of it, but a pedophile could have a $100 app on his device in the car outside the school, intercepting your children on their cell phones or their laptops or their iPads when they're not supposed to be, but you know what kids will do, right? They'll be saying, oh, I'm meeting you down at Dunkin' Donuts after school. You know, oh, mom and dad, my folks aren't going to be home, so come over to my. They can pick up all sorts of sensitive data. If you are hardwired, they're going to have a heck of a time getting to that data. So it's not only safer, it's more secure, it's faster, and the connections themselves are far more reliable on a hardwired system.
Yes.
And here in the US, most of our buildings are hardwired already. We've got fiber optics all the way up to the curb, at which point it goes into the building, that goes into Ethernet cables. It's all cabled all the way right up to those access points. All we have to do is disable those, or even hook an Ethernet cable into that access point, where the wires are, and just spider it down the walls and into the devices. So it's not hard to do. It's not cost prohibitive. This is, for example, an iPad. So with a laptop, you can usually just plug an Ethernet cable right into it.
Yes.
But for a Chromebook, you would need to get this little adapter here for like $12. For the iPad, you need that little lightning adapter into the camera adapter with your power cord, and then it goes right in there. Mm-hmm. And I actually tried this configuration out with my teenage daughter on her cell phone, because she had an iPhone, and she sits there and does her homework for 3 hours a night, collaborating with friends. So we have her laptop hardwired, but I was really nervous about that cell phone. So I tried this configuration, and I said, humor me, and teenager rolling her eyes at me, and I said, try it. Can you do anything? And she said, hey, yeah, it works. And I said, well, download something. She says, wow, the speed is so much faster. And then I saw the light go off, and she said, so if I'm hardwired and I've gone in and turned off all of the wireless antennas in there, does that mean it's not eating into my data plan? And I said, yes. And she's allocated a certain number of limited minutes a month, and if she goes over, she has to pay out of pocket.
Sure.
Teach them how to use things responsibly. So she was excited. When she is on the go and actually has to use it, we encourage her to keep it in airplane mode all the time. But knowing that she won't blow through her data plan and have to pay more was a huge bonus to her.
That's great.
Yeah. So my mind goes towards solutions, right? So now we've got these bills, and with gratitude to many people across Massachusetts who have been behind every one of them. Because I am a grant writer, I knew that Ashland had a pot of money because the Ashland Marathon runs through our town. The Boston Athletic Association gives us these bibs, and people in our community take those bibs and agree to fundraise. That money goes into a pot to be reinvested into our community. So I applied for a grant, and I thought, why don't we get an acoustimeter, and we can put it in our public library, and then everybody could take it out, go home, and see what their exposures are, and then make choices around how to keep themselves and their families safe.
Sure.
So the first time I applied, I was still learning a great deal, and our Board of Selectmen said, well, why don't you come back next time? So I came back next time, and then they were like, oh, it's probably more of a Board of Health thing. And by then, I knew that our Board of Health didn't understand this issue.
Yeah.
But when I got to testify for Senator Spilka's bill last session, I was holding up, the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. I was holding up Ashland's best practices. I was holding up the bioinitiative report and my meter, because you only get 3 minutes to testify, so it's like whoop, 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 whoop.
Yes, indeed.
And I was watching their eyes, and I thought I was reading that not one member of that Joint Committee on Public Health even knew before we started testifying that this issue existed. So
I think you're very much a pioneer.
well,
and thank goodness you are.
how can you not be, though, when I brought this technology into our schools? We're leaving our children exposed to it for 7 hours a day for, 13 years just in regular school?
Right.
So I committed to going in and speaking one by one with somebody on staff or the legislators themselves for every member of the Joint Committee on Public Health. And while I was there, I went over to the federal building and I spoke with Senator Markey's office and Senator Warren's office. I reached out to my Congresswoman Catherine Clark in DC. I met with the governor's office, because if Senator Spilka's bill is passed and we get to form that commission, he would be making the appointments to who sits on there. And I met with the Department of Public Health, and we're really trying to get people educated, because you can't make change unless you know about the issue.
That's right.
So once I realized, it took about an hour conversation like you and I are having tonight for somebody to really get the magnitude of this issue, I doubled back to my town and I asked if I could meet individually with our Board of Selectmen. And I met in coffee shops, I met in people's homes, some came to my home, and one by one I educated them. And then I resubmitted my grant application, and they actually gave me a grant for the acoustimeter. So Ashland Public, we've got one with a barcode on it in its little pouch that any Ashland resident can take out for a week. take it out, go to your neighbors, go to your family members, and just measure away.
Measure
and then
your
decide.
office. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Your office, your school, your workspace, your car. Ooh, cars are tough because you're inside a metal box that amplifies. Same thing with airplanes, same thing with elevators. We just need to become educated and then do what we can to protect ourselves. And for those who are just beginning, there's a woman in Australia who wrote a book called Wireless Wise Kids. And it's about the size of a scholastic book, but she worked in the Australian government with telecommunications, and she had also been a school teacher. So she took her skill set and did a very simple book that will walk any adult or child through how are these signals transferring, and what does it mean biologically, and what can we do with every one of our devices to use them more safely.
That's great.
Yeah, so some countries have the hardwired infrastructure. Not every country does. All they have is the cell towers and the wireless. So we need to just take a giant step back, assess, do the gap analysis, and figure out country by country what we can do until the industry brings biologically safe mobile technology to market. And when Frank Craig, the retired Microsoft Canada president, was here, he said, given a nudge, industry can figure this out. But, as we know, they're making it hand over fist.
Sure.
So I think the nudge is coming. I think we're getting to a tipping point. We're seeing lawsuits overseas where one woman was given compensation because the smart meter made her sick. Another, ironically, worked for a telecom company, and in his job had to use his cell phone for conference calls, and he wound up with tumors. I can't remember if it was brain tumors and or salivary gland tumors, but he was given the equivalent of Social Security benefits because of that. And there are other actions happening. In fact, in Southborough here in Massachusetts, there was a little boy at the Fay School that kept winding up in the nurse's office, right, with those symptoms of headache, nausea, insomnia, inability to concentrate, couldn't focus on his schoolwork. And some days he'd buck up and go back to school. Other days, mom or dad would have to take off work and come get him to the doctors. Basic, regular doctors have not been trained on this.
Sure.
They started seeing a pattern. If he was home on school vacation or summer break, he would recover his health and be fine. Within a day or two of being back at the Fay School with those industrial strength routers, he got symptomatic all over again. So they started researching his symptoms, the parents, and they discovered electrosensitivity, and then they were able to find a doctor trained in environmental medicine who could then give him an actual diagnosis. They brought it back to the school and said, we have a doctor's note, can we perhaps hardwire the 10 classrooms that our now 7th grader would need to be in? And they weren't really interested in helping. This is the school district that feeds into the St. Mark's School.
Yes, it is.
Which is where Saudi princes send their children to be educated. So they have a wait list, and unfortunately, the administrator in that district has a reputation for disenrolling families the next year that raise issues rather than giving them the supports that they need. So, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, every child on American soil should have reasonable access to their education. And this family actually offered to pay out of pocket to hardwire the 10 classrooms, and still the Fay School would not accommodate.
That was in our papers extensively.
Yes, and so that is still in court, in the federal courts in Worcester right now. So that's another lawsuit. And what people don't realize from the legal perspective is that the insurance industry already recognizes electromagnetic radiation as one of the top risks. Lloyd's of London will not cover electromagnetic radiation. And other policies are starting to put in disclaimers. If you get hurt, it's not on us, it's on the company.
I see.
So for schools, for municipalities, for people who own companies, that's a big risk exposure. So it would behoove us to come up to speed and start going back to hardwired, only using mobile technology when you absolutely have to have it. So buying something like a meter or having one in your community that everyone can have access to is a great way to start getting your mind around it. The town of Ashland, so that meter in Ashland Public Library, I'm told, is the first in the nation. And I'm also told that we're the first in the nation to host a documentary film and discussion series. Our friends at the library hosted that in collaboration with the Ashland Farmers Market. And for 6 sessions, we showed films, we showed the panel of experts that came to Massachusetts. There are documentaries already existing on this all over the world that we simply don't know about. So getting a meter, getting the literature, getting the documentaries, getting educated will really help us to go. So when that Dr. Deborah Davis brought this panel of experts to Massachusetts, I had the privilege of doing a little bit of work with Dr. Davis for some grant writing that she was pursuing. And during that time, she was contacted by somebody in the UK who had started a remediation company, but soon realized that without education, remediation can't really happen. You have to get educated first. So they were building online courses to educate anybody in the English-speaking world what this is. And so Dr. Davis, knowing that I had been active in this school space and in the legislative space, put me in touch with this Brett West and his wife Lynn in the UK. And I said, I'm a technical writer. If there's anything I can do with my skill set to help you get these courses out to the public, just let me know. And I was between work commitments then. Brett, who's a technologist, was in between contracts then. And Dr. Davis also put in touch with one of the most brilliant scientists on this in Europe. So Dr. Mikko Ahonen out of Finland, he's now out of Sweden. We were all in between work commitments for this coincidental 3-month period, and we just hit it hard. We distilled the scientific findings from all over the world, the medical advisories from all over the world, because other countries already have protocols for recognizing, diagnosing, and treating electrosensitivity, let alone all the cancers and the heart disease and the infertility. They know what our country doesn't know yet. So we have literally distilled that all into a 40-minute online course for less than the cost of a movie ticket. We've formalized a nonprofit, so we're not in to make a gazillion dollars. We need to cover our expenses, and we wanted to put the price point where just about anybody could afford it. So we have, 40 minutes, schools and families. Go online, take the course. At the end, it kicks out a safety fact sheet with little tips, day to day, what can you do to ensure your safety? Number 1 rule, hardwire and turn it off. But if you have to be on the go with a mobile device, here's what you do. We also have a corporate safety induction course where literally in 40 minutes, you can teach your entire workforce on their lunch hour how to use technology safely.
Terrific.
Yeah, so we're trying. We know it seems like it comes out of left field because most of us haven't heard it. When you look at the top lobbyists in DC and you look at the top advertisers in mainstream America, you see the telecommunications companies.
Yes,
Listen to the ads. You see the energy companies, you see technology companies, and they are primary advertisers. So our main advertising venues cannot afford to bite the hand that feeds them. So we do not get true investigative journalism at this point in time today at the national level. At the local level, we do get a little bit better coverage, and with deep gratitude to our cable stations, community by community, we can do something like this. It can be uploaded on TelView, and it can be picked up all across the country. So I'm very grateful to the Northborough Cable Access for having us in here tonight, and to the folks in the community who brought us in to talk.
It is lovely.
But one thing I would say to the municipalities is that our local leadership teams need to become educated on this.
Yes, they do.
In 2016, the U.S. National Toxicology Program began reporting out findings from their largest ever study. It's a $25 million multi-year study that's been literally going on for years. They went in expecting to see that cell phone radiation is harmless. Instead, in the very first set of peer-reviewed findings, they found DNA damage, which we know is the roadmap for how to properly grow a human, brain tumors and heart tumors in a statistically significant number of Sprague Dawley rats, and these rats are chosen because what happens in these rats tends to happen in humans, and perhaps even to a greater degree because these rats have a little bit more mechanism of protection than we do. So normally the scientists would wait until all the study's findings are concluded, get them all peer-reviewed, published, and out to the public. Because this has such great public health implications, they told the FDA, they told the FCC, and they tried to tell the public. The FDA commissioned this study. The FCC, within weeks of learning of these results, rather than telling the public, turned around and pushed to get 5G spectrum approved, because we're pretty much maxed out on 3G and 4G, that signal band. There's not much more room to grow or profit off of that. So they've gotten approval for 5G millimeter spectrum. Millimeter waves, they're still microwave radiation waves. So instead of protecting the public, the head of the CTIA back in 2016, his name was Tom Wheeler. Back in the 90s, when the first cancer patient died from those tumors, the head of the CTIA was Tom Wheeler. So Harvard University has published a report called Captured Agency: How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industries it Presumably Regulates. This takes you top to bottom, because I didn't know, my instinct was surely somebody's got our back. I had no experience to teach me that the industry is protecting corporate profit over public health. But Captured Agency is a 59-page report. You can just Google it, it'll come up, and it's free.
The FCC also has demonstrated that with advertising toward children, and this is prominently displayed in a film that you can look at online called Consuming Kids.
Yes.
They're operating in the same way, and that is the reason why children are allowed to see so much violence in this country. We're the only country that does not regulate what our children see, and it's because of FCC regulations. So they're operating very similarly on also a very important topic.
There's a movie that Will Smith did. I think it was in the last year. It's called Concussion.
Yes.
And it profiles the doctor who discovered that all this head-to-head contact in football, all the hits, were causing the brain to bounce around the skull, and as one aged, it became such a huge, huge illness for so many of our athletes. But the NFL owned a day of the week, and they did not want to shed any light that would hurt their profits, right? So if you watch that movie Concussion, and every time they say concussion, you could swap out that word for electromagnetic radiation, and you would have the exact same story where our scientists are being squeezed out of their universities.
Yes.
They're being squeezed out by telecom dollars. Our advertisers are not telling the truth. And I just sat there riveted watching that movie, which is an excellent movie unto itself, but it was the exact same thing. Tell the truth. Tell the truth and give people a right to know, because now we have safety precautions in all of our schools around concussions. We're just at one point in time with wireless radiation, and with a little bit of knowledge, we can move that forward and use safe technology, but in ways that won't give us biological or psychological damage.
Well, you've accomplished so much in 3 years since you really began this journey.
Well,
you've become so competent to add to your passion.
Yeah, well, I stand on the heels of giants. Last year, a group of very brave scientists and doctors got together and issued the International EMF, Electromagnetic Field, Scientists' Appeal to the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and all the member states, saying the science is clear, this is hazardous, we need to be protecting the public. Sadly, back in 2011, when they had a World Health Organization commission that studied this, they classified it as a 2B possible human carcinogen. That's not at the bottom of the scale. It's not at the second rung on the ladder. It's at the third point, saying this looks to be carcinogenic, but we don't understand the science well enough. We should have invoked the precautionary principle then that says, do the science, stop using it, and don't resume until there is evidence that it's
Right.
safe. So that was a good commission back in 2011. Today, that same commission does not have the right representation anymore of scientists and public health experts who biologically understand this technology. It's stacked with industry representatives. So to their huge credit, more than 220 scientists and public health experts who had done the research signed on to this international appeal and said, protect the public.
Yes.
Hold the industry accountable, hold the utility companies accountable. Don't let them put these utility smart meters on our homes. Create white zones so people who are sensitive can still get to the doctors, the grocery stores, stay in a hotel. And then this past winter, a group of experts gathered in Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland, and held a conference. And at the end of that, they published the Reykjavik appeal for schools. So the Reykjavik appeal on wireless technology in schools, and they are saying in countries where you can, hardwire everything, turn off the Wi-Fi, and do not use it in any child setting. So bravo
Very
to our
strong.
leaders.
Yes.
But we just need to listen because the evidence is very clear.
Yes, we certainly do need to listen, and I do hope in Northborough that we take this quite seriously and a part of the movement.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
Thank you for coming and telling
right.
all of this.
You
Beautiful.
betcha. Bye-bye.